Hey class, good to be back with you. This week we're going to be talking about public opinions and political socialization. Sorry about that. How do we acquire our frames of reference? What reference points do we have that help us to evaluate the many issues that we have in politics on an everyday basis? And probably the most important aspect that um, we have in our development politically and socially, without a doubt, is your family. A lot of the values and ideas and concept that have made you and I who we are today, we have because of our families, right? The the things that are often priority in our life, when we think about it, they were priorities of our parents and our grandparents. Sometimes when we don't even want necessarily, maybe even it happens unconsciously, we didn't even realize that how much we have become or adopted the values and philosophies of our parents and grandparents. It's amazing as a parent. Um, Sometimes I find myself saying things that to my children that I know that when I was a child and my parents were saying those things to me, um, I said I'm never going to say that. And yet I find myself doing that or doing those things. My mother was a clean freak. Everything had to be clean, and I find the older I get, the more I'm like her. Shoes on the floor bother me, those sorts of things. But that aspect of being influenced by our family is bleeds over into our political thinking as well. So when we're talking about politics and political socialization, we're really talking about what were the values that we were given? Where did we get the values that we have? How do those values impact how we vote, the decisions we make politically? Um, for instance, when you talk to people, and perhaps you're even in your own life, your own political development, you'll hear many people say, "Well, I'm a Republican because my parents were Republicans, and my grandparents and all my aunts and uncles, or all of my family have always been Democrats." Now, granted, that's not a rule; that's a generality. So that there are times that people will have differing, their family may be all Democrats and they're the only Republican, or they may be the only Democrat in a home full of or a family full of Republicans. So they may be the black sheep of the family at Christmas. But nevertheless, our family plays a important part in how we are um, in how we develop and what our values are. But there are other aspects that when we identify with certain groups, for instance, religion has a definite impact on how people identify politically and the types of political decisions that they make on policy issues based upon deeply held religious beliefs, and that's very important. In fact, it's one of the most powerful dynamics in any type of orientation, any type of group orientation today. Economic class impacts how much money that you have, what levels of education that you have been afforded, um, uh, the types of jobs that you work. Um, that impacts decisions that you make, the region of the country you're in. Um, there is a wonderful book, and I had it here in my office, and I wanted to. It's by Colin Woodward. and I should have had it with me. The region of the country that you're in. Now, you think about this. You think about the election, this past presidential election, 2016, and you look at a map of where the votes are. What areas voted which way, and it's pretty astounding that certain regions of the country tend to vote strongly one party or the other, for instance. And that impacts how politicians carry out their business. For instance, it didn't matter how much time and money that President Trump spent in California, he was not going to win the California vote. California votes historically strongly Democrat. Um, the converse is true here in Oklahoma. There wasn't a whole lot of campaigning by either campaign, including the campaign of Hillary Clinton, because she was never going to win it. So the region, the values of that region, and you'll hear or commentators talk about blue states and red states, and the Midwest and the middle of the country being more conservative, and the coast being less conservative, being blue, Northeast, and um, the West Coast being mostly liberal and voting Democrat. So where you live has a lot to do with how you vote. Gender impacts how people vote. Men and women think differently about social issues, such as child care or the use of military force. So that plays a part in how people vote. Age, what generation you're from. Different people with different ages tend to have different values. And as we grow older, our values tend to change. What you value as a young person, as an 18-year-old, is probably not going to be the same as they will be when you're 65. Um, you know, I'm not 65. However, I can tell you without exception that my values and my understanding has changed over the years. So your age influences how you vote. So there's a lot of influence in how we think, and how we think tends to affect how we vote. But when political scientists are trying to forecast how a vote is going to go, the number one factor in determining or predicting how a vote is going to go is party loyalty. And what I mean by that is that Democrats and Republicans tend to have very different philosophies in terms of how to reach a goal. Now, there's one thing that I want you to think about is that oftentimes, both conservative and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, um, have the same goal, but they quite frequently have very different ideas about how to get there. Okay, now let's just take a small example. For instance, no matter if you're Democrat or Republican, you believe in a strong economy. I think that's something we all want. We all want to prosper. However, conservatives would typically subscribe to the trickle down economics theory, and that's the idea that if through tax breaks and reduction of uh, regulation you allow businesses and industries to flourish, that allowing businesses and industries to flourish by allowing them tax breaks will raise the income of even the lowest class, that eventually the economic benefit of that will trickle down from the big businesses down to the everyday average run-of-the-mill guy and gal. A more liberal approach would be, let's tax the big businesses, take their profits, and invest those profits into the average person. And you see that through tax rebates, social welfare programs. Over the last several years, there have been several um, attempts to use the, if you will, trickle up economics, um, by offering everyone a what the government, what Congress called a stimulus check, meaning they sent everyone a check, hoping that everybody would go out and spend that check, and that would sort of jumpstart the economy. And that's sort of just a one small example of the differences between a Republican approach and a Democratic approach, even though both parties are seeking the same thing: economic prosperity for our country. But the number one predictor in terms of voter behavior is party loyalty. And what that means is that because of those differences in approaches, and we constantly hear, and you may say it yourself, we said it at the table, you hear the commentators, well, I just wish Republicans and Democrats would work together and get along. And that's challenging because there are some pretty stark differences in approach between Democrats and Republicans. And so compromise is not easy. But for that reason, Democrats tend to vote Democrat, Republicans tend to vote Republican. And so you can predict, and if you'll notice during especially the presidential election, if you watch the news coverage over it as the counts are coming in from the different voting precincts around the country, if you'll notice, the commentators will say CNN is going to call Virginia for Hillary Clinton. And then you look at the percentage of precincts and the percentage of precincts that have actually reported what their actual voting totals are, maybe 3%, 5%, a very low percentage. And yet the news agencies, in their rush to be the first to make a call, and of course that sort of backfired on them in 2016, they go ahead and try to predict that. How do they do that? Well, they have people that are looking at historical voting turnout, how many registered Republicans, how many registered Democrats are living in each area. And they can kind of determine, based upon the numbers of registered Democrats and registered Republicans, just based on those numbers and historical turnout percentages, who's going to win that race. Because we don't cross the lines. And historically, we've seen a couple of presidents maybe who've been able. Ronald Reagan is very well known for his Reagan Democrats. He's one of just a few, maybe, if not the only president who really, at least in modern history, was able to reach across the aisle to Democrats and convince them to vote Republican. But that is an unusual tendency. But the question in our discussion is, in what ways are political parties impacting the voting process? Are they good for the American voter? Do you feel that they have too much influence, and is their influence good or bad? And explain your answers. I want you to really think about what it is political parties do. What is it that they do that's positive? Now, let me warn you, it's real easy to just jump on the negative side of things with political parties. But I want you to really think about what political parties do that are positive. And they do some positive things. They do narrow the field down. Right? If we didn't have a political party and we were going to elect a president, the the field of possible presidents is millions and millions of people. It would be impossible to know and choose one if you had to choose from a field of a million. Whereas political parties narrow them down, and sometimes there are more and sometimes there are less. For instance, this year in this past election, 2016, the Republicans had quite a number of candidates. But as many as they had, I think the Democrats had about 4 presidential candidates when they started the process, the nomination process. That still narrowed the field down to just a handful of people, which makes it relatively easy for the voter to choose one particular candidate. Secondly, I think they facilitate you knowing the candidate, knowing what the candidate is. Now the flip side of that is that you are going to know about the candidate what the political parties want you to know, right? Um, Political parties are not going to give you the flip side of the coin, or as Paul Harvey said, they're not going to give you the rest of the story. So they educate us about the candidate. They, but at the same time, they shelter that candidate from negative publicity. They help they help bring a coalition together of like-minded people to support or combat a particular issue. So they have their place. So what I want you to do is really think about, before you start writing, start thinking about what they do good. Focus on what are the positive things that political parties do. And then I want you to think about the negative things. And um, and there are all kinds of negative things. I just mentioned one, really shading or preventing the public from knowing what a candidate is really like, only giving us the good side of them, never letting us see the bad side. The good side is that political parties help educate us on issues. Um, the bad side is that political parties tend to only share with the voter their particular view. And then I think one of the real negative things is that's going on in our society today is that the the political parties seem to be trying to take advantage over cultural instability in America. That there are some really clash of ideas. Not that we have not had clash of ideas in the past. We have, and they've been severe at times. But they seem to be uh, stirring the pot, so to speak, in order to preserve their particular party being in office. So I want you to think about those things. Write about 250 words. Make sure that you are using textbooks and um, other sources to substantiate. I want you to give your opinion, but I want you to give me the proof of your opinion. Substantiate your opinion using accepted fact, academic things like your academic textbook. All right, if you need me, give me an email, give me a call. I'm here for you anytime you need me. I'll see you next time.